There are two revolts that are fought. The Jews rebel against the Roman occupation. One ends in the destruction of the temple in 70. And then there's another one about 60 years later called the Bar Kokhba Revolt from 132 to 135 CE AD. After that, the Emperor Hadrian and others decide, we're done with this. Jews are barred from Jerusalem. Where do they go?
Dr. Pytlik, in the prior segment, you talked about how the Jews were expelled from their homeland. Um, what I want to know is from what point in time, do Jews begin to leave this geographical area? And by the term leave, I'm just using it for the limited purposes of this conversation. I don't mean that term to be a defining term for what happened to them.
It occurs at different stages. So, as I tell my classes, when we get to studying the Babylonian invasion and the destruction of the wider region and Jerusalem and the exile, that kind of could be the end of the story here for the Jewish people. Could have been. It's not. It has its own, journey after that. The Persians allow the Jews to come back. They thrive. It's an economic boom. The Greeks come in, sort of continues, and then we have Hellenism and the Romans and so on. There are two revolts that are fought. The Jews rebel against the Roman occupation. One ends in the destruction of the temple in 70. And then there's another one about 60 years later called the Bar Kokhba Revolt from 132 to 135 CE AD. After that, the Emperor Hadrian and others decide, we're done with this. Jews are barred from Jerusalem. Where do they go? Now, there's a sizable population at this point, but there's a sizable population of others in the area. Greeks, Romans, non-aligned, just, all kinds of different people. Zoroastrians, it's a mixed bag over there. For the most part, Jews go to the coast and they go to the north, and some leave. There are big populations around this time in places like, say, for example, Rome or Sardis or Alexandria, in southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, even parts of very southern France. And so there's a dispersion. They're very active. They pick up lives in those other locations. So there's always a core group there, but there's people leave for a number of reasons. Economic, they have certain skills. Like today, you go where there's work, or you go to big population centers where there's also centers of Jewish learning. Baghdad was one of our, Babylon. Alexandria was another. And so, yes, some people leave, some people are expelled, but usually it's right around Jerusalem that it's the expulsion is. The people go to the north to the Galilee, and there's a whole nother history right there with the development of the Talmud and rabbis and so on and so forth. So, but there's a big diaspora already by the 2nd and 3rd century, even earlier.
First of all, when we think about Jews leaving the area of Israel around Jerusalem, what have you, and you mentioned Rome, Alexandria, and southern France, is this normal for that time? These are far distances. Did these sort of migrations happen?
Yeah, it's surprisingly more cosmopolitan than we might think. There's already and well established sea trade. If anything that we get from, say, the Cairo Geniza, the hundreds of thousands of documents. Now they're later, but they report a history of economics and daily life of the Near Eastern Jewish community based in Egypt, Cairo, from about 800 to upwards to the 19th century, for example. This rich trove of documents tells us there are something like 400 different trades that people were engaged in, mostly Jews, because this is the Jewish depository of texts.
Yeah.
They're trading with India. They
Oh,
are
wow.
going to Muslim centers and learning how to negotiate through trade or through, business generally. And the problems that come from that, such as leaving for long periods of time and who's going to take care of the estates and the rights of women and the rights of women in divorce and all kinds of other things. It's fascinating. It's a much more complicated I call it the lake, the big lake of the Mediterranean.
By the way, for our audience, in my last conversation with you, it happened 2 years ago, you talked about this treasure trove of documents in the Geniza found in Jerusalem. I think it was Solomon Schechter that found it.
Cairo, but yes.
Cairo, yes. We won't get into that, but I'll provide a link to that conversation, which is really fascinating, and includes discussions of business and women running businesses, and it goes several, I think, 900 or 1,000 years back in history.
Exactly.
So, is it safe for me to sort of conclude that there was not this refugee mode of fleeing the area? And the only reason I'm using those words because I'm using my own modern understanding of leaving an area. For example, what we saw 5, 6, 7 years ago with Syria, right? Refugees coming on boat. I guess they're still doing that from North Africa.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So it sort of happened gradually and incrementally.
We get a different, we're missing big parts of the story. We're missing the average person's experience. I don't want to paint a broad brush or broad painting here that this was like, okay, really advantageous to move to Alexandria and we made a lot of money and everybody was happy. There are stages of this that really affect everybody. And the ones who don't get to tell their story are the ones who are like probably the average person, right?
Yeah.
When the Assyrian army comes in the 8th century in waves, this is a mighty, mighty empire with a brutal military, a very effective but yet brutal military machine. They take communities and city-states all over the Levant, not just Israel, and they displace those people. So those people have really no choice. Now, I'll just tell you how graphic.
So this is forced migration.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there is that. The Romans were not, kind in some cases either, as no people is kind at all times. But I will tell you this: when we excavated a site called Lachish,
where was that?
Lachish is about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
It's opposite the Gaza Strip by about 15 miles or so, central Israel. Okay, so in the 1930s, when this was first excavated, the British archaeologist Leslie Starkey found there in the side of the tell, this artificial mound, a huge sort of repository of over at least 11 to 1,200 corpses or body skeletons.
Wow.
And he wrote about it and he discussed it, and he really didn't have the methods we have today, obviously in the 1930s, but the assumption was that this might have been one of the mass exterminations that occurred during an invasion. Now, Lachish has a really solid evidence here of the Assyrian invasion in 701. It might be from that, where the men mostly were either killed or conscripted as labor, and the women and children marched off. Now we have evidence of destruction of that city, and it wasn't pretty at all. So we have that. Now we tried in the last years, it was covered over and never re-excavated. We tried in the last few years to try to find that at that site. We haven't really been successful. And part of the reason is that there's a whole thing about working with human remains in the Near East generally, and other societies as well. So some people are just more content to leave it alone. But this was not exactly a pretty experience for these people. They don't get a voice. So archaeology gives a bit of a voice, but we don't have the whole picture. So it wasn't always pretty. And when we say forced migrations, that usually means a great deal of death and, slavery and all these other things that go with it.
So I guess I should correct myself here then. My summation, paraphrasing of what you were sharing with me about leaving Jerusalem, much of that story comes from people who successfully left, who were sort of elite. They became merchants, they rode, and they did things.
Right.
There's a lot of violence and death and destruction with a lot of people whose voices we just haven't heard. They've just been lost, such as the 11 to 1200 corpses that you talked about in Lachish. Did I say that right?
Lachish, yeah.
And that site is closed off. You haven't been able to get access to it and examine.
No, just that particular call it a grave area, a depository. We have dug the site in other places. It's a huge site. So we were just trying to see if we could find where the original place was located. We think we know, but what are we going to do? I'm not sure we're going to go back in there or anything like this. It's a very dicey thing, and we had other research plans.
Yeah. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Pytlik as we get into the perspective.